Welcome back to Talking Pictures. I'm your host, Tim Rosenberger, and today we're going to be talking about the Marx Brothers. And I have brought a very dear friend of mine to discuss them today. He is actually related to the Marx Brothers. He has played Groucho on stage, and he is, of course, a big fan. Before I welcome him in, he does have to tell me the password.
Swordfish.
Exactly. By the way, I will never get tired of that joke. So, this is my dear friend Mike. Mike, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me here, Tim.
So, I mentioned that you are related to the Marx Brothers. Why don't you tell us how you're related to them?
Albeit a fairly circuitous route, Groucho's mother, Minnie Schoenberg, was my grandmother, Minnie Wohl. She was her fifth cousin. Although it's very clear that the bloodline runs through the family, because I'm one of five, and all five of us look like Groucho, including my sister. Same mustache.
And you played Groucho on stage. What show was that for?
That was Groucho, A Life in Review, a show written by Groucho's son, Arthur. It's a three-person show. One person plays Groucho from teenager all the way through elderly Groucho with the beret and the big glasses. Another fellow plays Chico and Harpo. And one girl plays every female character from the myriad of Groucho's wives to Margaret Dumont. We did that down at the Apollo Theater back in the 1980s, and it was a great thrill to play Groucho through all the life periods of him. In fact, I even did the makeup changes on stage. I'd start out as young Groucho, clean shaven, no glasses, no nothing. Turn my back to the audience, and while I was telling them how the boys got their nicknames, I'd be putting the grease paint on my lip, on my eyebrows, put on the steel-framed glasses. I'd turn out to the audience, and every night there would be a gasp. Because, well, when I was much trimmer than I am today, the resemblance was quite astounding.
And for those who don't know, this is not the famous Apollo Theater. This is the Apollo Theater in Peoria, Illinois. So how old were you when you did that?
I was probably right around 30 years old at the time. It's been at least 22, maybe even longer than that. 22, 23 years ago.
How old was the show? Was this a fairly new show at the time?
No, it had actually been written back in the late 70s, probably right after Groucho died, because Arthur wanted to have the freedom to write whatever he wanted to write once his father was gone, and was originally done on Broadway by Louis J. Statlin, great character actor and Grouchophile from way, way back.
To go back a little bit, how did you first get introduced to them in their movies?
In the tradition of old Jewish people, Jews are just by nature funny. And so whenever there was a funny film on, my father would make sure we watched it, and when a Marx Brothers film was on, there could be no speaking. The occasional laughter, but no speaking, because he wanted to catch every single one of those jokes.
And as a kid, what was your kind of reaction to them?
Oh, I loved the organized chaos that was a Marx Brothers film, and the occasional double entendre that actually slipped through.
As you got older, did your relationship with these movies change at all?
You know, I would catch things that I hadn't caught when I was younger and more naive, and just really learn to appreciate the absurdity, especially of the early films where it was pure Marx Brothers, other than Marx Brothers being plugged into a script and trying to make that work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so why don't we jump right into The Coconuts, which is the Marx Brothers. It's their first feature film. They had done a silent film before that. I think it was a short. It wasn't them playing their usual characters. I don't know. That film might be lost now. I forgot to check. But this is the first feature film. This is them playing the characters that everybody knows.
Based on one of their Broadway shows.
Yes, based on one of the Broadway shows. It was the first of only two films that they shot in New York City. And it was made in 1929, so this is very early talking periods. The film, if you watch it, it's fairly obvious that this is very early talkies. The basic plot of this, if you can call it a plot, because the first five films, for people who don't know, they have plots, but they're very loose, and they're basically just there to
tie the bits together.
Yeah, tie the bits together and accommodate their anarchy. This stars Groucho, Harpo, Chico, and, by the way, that is Chico, not Chico, and Zeppo. Well, and sort of Zeppo. And Groucho runs a hotel in the film in, I think it's Florida.
During the land boom in Florida back in the late 20s.
And it's not a very successful hotel. And Zeppo plays a clerk, I believe, or somebody working for Groucho. I don't know his official title.
Somebody nondescript, as Zeppo was apt to do.
Yes. Basically, a Groucho assistant, which he did in all but two of the films he was in. And Chico and Harpo are basically thieves who have come to the hotel to make away with any property or money that they can. And while Groucho is trying to run a successful business, and Chico and Harpo are trying to steal whatever they can, some bad man is trying to steal Margaret Dumont's necklace worth $100,000, which for those who don't know inflation, that was even more money than it was now. So they try to steal the necklace and hijinks ensue. And that's basically all you need to know about that film. So
that is about as exciting as it gets, yes.
Yes. So, like I mentioned, this is very early talkies, and this was based off a stage show. And unfortunately, this adaptation of the stage show is a very obvious adaptation of a stage show.
It's very, very flat.
Yeah, and there's a lot of... Well, it's a couple of things. One, it's adapted from a stage show. Two, like I said, it's early talkies. So they had to put the cameras in soundproof booths at that time. So what that basically means is there are some, but there's very little moving camera shots. Most of the time, it's a static camera with two people standing in the middle of the room, and they're talking with very few cuts, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And that gets a bit tedious.
That it does. And one of the other challenges with the Coconuts, they were filming the Coconuts during the day and performing animal crackers on stage at night.
I wonder if that had to do with... Because one thing I noticed, and I don't know, maybe it's because of that, or maybe it's because of its early talkies, but especially in the first half of the film, does it seem like people are very slow?
Yeah, the pacing is very much off, and it's because they're exhausted. You know, theater people in general are not morning people. Groucho, in particular, was not a morning person. Without his coffee and his cigar, well, he could live up the name Groucho, let's put it that way. And Chico, of course, after he finished with the theater, he'd go out gambling and drinking, so early morning was definitely not his friend.
Another thing that's kind of, I think, odd about this film is the musical numbers are very random, and the dancing is very random. Like, at the beginning of the film, it starts with Groucho going down the hotel stairs and saying something to his...
Minions.
Minions, basically. And then he finishes, and then for no reason at all, they just dance.
Yeah.
And they make a reference to it later, but it makes no sense.
That, once again, is also pre-1935 Broadway. Basically, you had a play, and you had some songs you bought off a song plugger, and you fit them into the show wherever.
Yeah, but don't they usually... Because, like, in some of the earlier musicals I've seen, while they're not songs in the sense that we know now that are carrying the storyline forward, getting character stuff across, all that stuff, while they're not doing that, they usually at least have an excuse, like the characters are doing a show, or they're performers, or whatever. This is nothing.
Yeah, like I said, probably by 35 for sure, but 32, 33, they're starting to weave the song in, and it actually serves a purpose where basically shows back in the early days were just musical reviews. You did a song, you did a sketch, you did a song, you did a sketch, and unfortunately Coconuts really does fit that formula.
I think it ages it maybe a bit in a bad way.
Yeah.
Definitely. But beyond that, like I said, there are very long takes in this, and I don't know how much of this was planned and how much of this is them messing up, but it seems like there are a lot of flubbed lines in this, and a lot of like, oh, my next line is this.
They finished doing Coconuts on Broadway, probably 6-8 months prior to it being turned into a film. And so the lines weren't real fresh to them still. And, they were so used to ad-libbing that whatever happened, they just went with it, whether it worked or not. And they weren't getting the audience response that they were used to from live theater. And henceforth why some of the hesitations are weird, because the laugh isn't there. And so I don't know whether they were thinking the laugh will come in the film, or whether... It's like, okay, what's the next bit? Okay, here we go. And that's fairly obvious in several of the really early films, especially in Coconuts and Animal Crackers. Once again, I think the timing was better in the live performance than with the camera, because, well, they weren't accustomed to the camera. Heck, in those days, the camera wasn't accustomed to the camera, because it was still a very new medium, the talking picture. I think that's part of why it just feels as stilted as it does.
Do we want to talk about Irving Berlin and the fact that such a great musician has really crummy songs in this, I think?
Well, always remember, for a man who wrote 500 songs, not all of them can be gems. Well, and he had a bit of a difficult relationship with Groucho. Groucho loved to to make Irving Berlin uncomfortable at every moment possible. Back in World War One, just before we entered the war, in fact, Irving Berlin wrote an anti-war song called Stay Down Where You Belong, about the devil talking to the son, saying the devils were up there in the kings and presidents, etc., sending their boys to war. Well, once the war started up, Irving Berlin switched over to Alexander's Ragtime Band and all the pro-war tunes, and Groucho, whenever he saw Irving Berlin, he would break into Stay Down Where You Belong, which would just irritate Irving to no end. Finally, Irving's like, Groucho, if you ever get the feeling to sing this song again, call me and I'll send you $100 not to. Groucho loved yanking Irving's chain, so I think Irving really didn't mind sending him tunes that were less than ideal.
How do you feel about the gags in this movie?
I think there were a few good ones. I think there were a few very weak ones. One of my favorites, mostly because it's a play on the language. Room number 24 wants somebody to come up and make his bed. Okay, send up some 2x4s and some nails, he can make his bed. Or he wants some ice water. Give him some onions. That'll make his ice water. You know, there's some nice little plays on words there, but overall the gags in general were, once again, just there. They weren't as polished as the later routines.
I find the first half of the film is pretty, in my opinion, abysmal. And then by the time you get to the viaduct scene...
Oh yeah. Why not a chicken? Yeah.
It seems to pick up, and while it's not hilarious, the energy is a bit better, and the jokes you get a bit. Yeah, you have the auction scene, so it does seem to pick up a bit.
And I'll agree with you. I think it's once again they're getting used to being in front of the camera. They're getting used to, and those were probably shot later in the day. Yeah, some of those bits have turned into classics. You can't say why a duck without somebody saying why not a chicken, because it's a well-written gag.
That and the auction scene are probably the best.
Best two bits in the whole.
Yeah, I mean, hell, I'm actually struggling to think of other bits.
Exactly.
In the movie, that's part of the problem.
As have I, and yeah, I've probably seen the film 50 times.
So what is your overall impression of this film?
Great first attempt. When you realize Talking Pictures, infancy. Marx Brothers, infancy. Although they'd been performing in vaudeville, they had only really developed these characters since about 1924 in Alsatias. So, you know, they were still trying to find their voices, other than Harpo. And, like I said, for a first attempt, good beat, a little hard to dance to, I give it a 5.
Would you recommend that somebody watch it?
If you want to really understand who the Marx Brothers were and how they developed through the years, I'd say it's a definite watch. If you're looking for something that's going to be knee-slapping hilarious, yeah, you may want to avoid this one.
I would say there is some good stuff in here. It can be few and far between, and it is dated in many...
It's a slow-moving train, yeah.
Yeah, many ways. But it's a kind of a nice view of how they started out. So I would say watch it, but don't... If it's your first Marx Brothers film, don't watch that one. And I wouldn't recommend you show it to somebody as their first Marx Brothers film. It's not a good place to start.
It's a good footnote, but it shouldn't be your first taste of the Marx Brothers.
No. So we can move on to their next film, which was Animal Crackers, which was made the very next year in 1930. Also based off a stage show. And this one, I'll have to admit that when I saw this film a few years ago, at the time, I was not a very big fan of it, and I found it very tedious, very slow. I didn't care about the romance in it at all. I didn't really find it very funny, and it was just not a very pleasant experience. Now this time, and maybe it was because I watched it right after the Coconuts, so in comparison,
yes,
but
it's a gem.
Yeah. So I saw it this time, and I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. For all the problems that we've mentioned for Coconut's suffering, it's really sound, it's a bit slow. This one still has problems, but it's improved leaps and bounds, I think, from the last one.
Yeah, the pacing is considerably better. The character development is quite a bit better. They weren't just, look at me, I'm doing this. Look at me, I'm doing this. And some great performers in that one as well. I'm trying to remember the fellow who played Hives the butler, and this man always played the butler. A.B. the Fishman. What a great routine. This fellow posing as an art expert and philanthropist. And Chico looks at, hey, it's A.B. the Fishman from Czechoslovakia. Hey, when did you become A.B. the Fishman? And he says to Chico, when did you become Italian?
Yeah, that is one of the few references to Chico, his character, actually being Italian. Oh, and for people that don't know, the very loose plot, and I'm using quotation marks for this, is they are in Margaret Dumont's manor in this film, and they're going to be presenting a famous piece of art. And similar to the last film, one person wants to steal it, one person wants to borrow it, and things get mixed up. And again,
And comedy ensues.
yes, mayhem ensues. Anyway.
One of the things I enjoy is Groucho's character is far more developed as Captain Jeffrey T. Spaulding, this African explorer who very famous for absolutely discovering nothing. And Groucho in a pith helmet. I mean, how can you go wrong? So he's here to woo Mrs. Rittenhouse, the immortal Margaret Dumont, the best straight man Groucho ever had. So he's making the play for Mrs. Rittenhouse and the other girl. Chico's running around as the orchestra director, and Harpo follows chasing the girls.
And Zeppo again is, I don't know,
Is Zeppo.
Is Groucho's secretary or whatever.
Lackey, yes.
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 But he does actually, speaking of Zeppo though, he does get a little bit to do in this one. Actually, he gets two things worth mentioning. There's a scene where he is taking a letter for Groucho, and he actually gets a few actual laugh lines. At one point, Groucho is writing a letter to somebody, or dictating a letter, and he goes through this whole spiel that I'm not going to get right, so I won't even try, but it's this whole long spiel that he does, and then he tells Zeppo to read it back. He reads back the introduction, and then says, well, I didn't write the rest of it because I didn't think it was important. Which is actually a good line.
It's a good line.
It's a good line. And the other thing Zeppo gets to do, which a lot of people probably won't notice if you aren't told about it, is there is a scene with Margaret Dumont. Her manor goes into a blackout because of a storm. And she has a scene with Groucho, only it's not Groucho. It is Zeppo dressed up as Groucho, and they're covering him up with the darkened light so you can't see that's him. Now, I don't know if it's his voice. I listened to it just the other day. It sounds a lot like Groucho, but they are brothers, so I really can't tell.
Honestly, I think Groucho did the voicing for it, but I'm not 100% sure. Never seen it written down one way or the other.
Yeah, so it could be Zeppo, it could be Groucho. And this actually does have some origins in their stage lives, because while he never developed a strong, some people say he did develop a light character for the film, some people say he didn't, but he never developed a strong one, and like his brothers did. But from what people have said, he was very good at mimicking their characters, and when they were sick or couldn't perform for whatever reason, he would perform for them. And there was a famous story where Groucho, I don't know, he had to have a surgery or something, and so he was out of the show they were doing for a little bit, and Zeppo filled in for him, and Groucho made the joke that he got better much quicker because Zeppo was getting more laughs than he was. And Zeppo was actually said to be the funniest of the Marx Brothers in real life, so there was some talent there that wasn't fully realized. But anyway, so he's kind of doing an offshoot of that, and he actually doesn't, from what you can see of him,
he pulls it off.
Yeah, he does a very good job, and it's kind of sad that we didn't get to see
more of it.
So he does actually get a bit to do in this film, not a lot, because it's Zeppo.
He is Zeppo, yeah.
He does get more to do than Gummo.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Like we said, the energy is better in this film. The bits are much better in this one.
Yes, they are. They're a little more tried and true, and I think they're a little fresher in their memories because they were just off finishing their run on Broadway with Animal Crackers. And I will also say the music overall is far better in Animal Crackers.
Yeah, it is better.
Most of it actually fits where it goes in.
Yeah, they are much better inserted into the story. I think they got that much better. They're not, well, let's be honest, I don't think any of the Paramount songs are good songs.
No. I don't know. Hooray for Captain Spaulding.
Well, okay, there are maybe 2 or 3 in the 5 films that they made for Paramount. There are 2 or 3 songs that are good songs. The rest of them, I challenge you to remember what the lyrics are, what the tune is.
They border on the superfluous, yes.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but for all of their Paramount films, none of them really have conclusions.
No, they just kind of end.
Yeah, they just kind of, especially this one, they find the painting finally, there's a happy ending.
Huzzah.
And then it just sort of peters out, and then there's the credits, which is a kind of a problem. There isn't really a build-up to something great in these films. It's just kind of gags.
But conversely, if you look at a lot of the talkies of that period, it's just what they did. They just fizzled out. One of the few exceptions is one of your favorite performers, Mr. Chaplin, who worked out every last detail of every last script. The Marxes weren't quite that detail-oriented.
You see the same problem with, and they have admitted this, Monty Python, with their films. They've admitted that they never really structured them basically to have smaller gags than grow up to their best. Like a stand-up comedian will end with his best thing. And in more modern comedies, that's what they're going to try to do. Monty Python didn't do that. The Marx Brothers in their early films did not do that. It was just it was just whatever gags they can fit together in whatever order they can do it.
Okay, we're done.
Yeah, and then they finish. So that is a bit disappointing. But yeah, I think the gags are better. It's, I think, tighter. Yeah. There's more energy to it, and it's overall better experience.
This is a good beginning film for people to introduce themselves to early Marx Brothers.
Yeah. Their next film is Monkey Business, continuing the animal-themed titles. Made again the very next year, in 1931. It was filmed in Hollywood. All the films from henceforth were filmed in Hollywood. And this is their first film that was not, at least directly based off of anything. I think there's some sketches in it that were
that they borrowed from some of their older scripts.
But this is not directly based off of anything that they did. So this was kind of different for them. They were doing something that they were not as familiar with because they hadn't done it many times.
It was actually just a screenplay rather than an adaptation of a show that they had been performing 3 times a day for 8 months. Yeah.
Oh, and I believe this is the only film that they did where none of them have names. If you ever look them up, they're all credited just as their quote-unquote real names. I mean, not that anybody calls Groucho in the film, but they just don't call them anything. They don't have names in the film.
Hey, you.
Yeah, basically. Basically. So the 4 of them are stowaways on a ship, and the film mostly consists of them trying to avoid being captured by the people who work on the ship. The last third of the film takes place off the ship and involves a love interest of Zeppo's being kidnapped by some gangsters. Actually, I want to start with Zeppo. This in Horse Feathers is probably the most he ever gets to do. Because this one, unlike the first 2 films he did and the last film he did, he's not Groucho's assistant. He's actually, especially this one, he is just kind of one of the gang, so to speak. And they come up with the bright idea of having the guy who's kind of playing the straight, handsome fourth lead to actually make him the romantic...
The love interest.
The love interest, which gives him a bit more to do. I wouldn't say he's funny in the film. I don't think he has any gags.
Not really, but at least you get to know him.
Yeah.
He's not just furniture.
Yeah.
Which Zeppo had been in the first 2 films.
Yeah, especially Coconuts, where he's at the beginning, he disappears for almost the entire thing, and he appears at the end, and that's it. But this one, he gets a bit more to do, which is, I think, nice. I mean, because I know a lot of people like to bag on Zeppo, but like we said, he did have some talent, and it's sad that, and he could be funny. I think even if he was playing more of himself, they could have given him more to do, and I really wish they had, because it seems unfair just because he didn't have a character, so to speak.
Right. He was the human out of the batch, because the rest of them were such caricatures. It does, unfortunately, send me back to the television show Cheers, and Bebe Neuwirth as Lilith, who was a self-proclaimed Zeppo Marx fan. I love how he stands up there and does nothing. They let him spread his wings a little bit, as much as he could.
Yeah, they still kind of are...
Ran him over. Yeah,
ran him over. And they could have given him... Because, I mean, he is the kind of straight man, but there are plenty of other characters that kind of serve as straight men. They didn't really need him to be a straight man. They could have had him be similarly comedic.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think they had so groomed him, after Gummo left the act, to be the sounding board that I don't think, especially Groucho, was comfortable enough to let Zeppo really develop into anything but Zeppo.
I think egos probably got in the way of that.
Oh, and there were plenty of egos among the brothers. So.
Was that mainly with... Because I can't imagine... Did Harpo have an ego?
No.
Did he have an ego? Okay.
He did. The classic story of why he quit speaking on stage. This was back in their vaudeville days.
I think in Champaign, right?
In Champaign, Illinois, you betcha. And he was doing everything to ham the stage up, throwing in talking it's where it didn't belong, da-da-da-da-da-da. And he got panned by the critic. Said basically to the effect of, the one thing Harpo could do to improve the act is never speak again.
From what I remember of that review, he was actually complimentary about when he wasn't talking.
Right.
He wasn't saying it in a totally cruel way. Yeah. But he couldn't keep up with the brothers.
No, and from that point on, Harpo never spoke on film.
Yeah, no. The most
or on stage.
The most you ever get, there's one song in one of the later films, I can't remember which one it is, where there's some debate whether he's moving his mouth to the song in unison with the other brothers. It's not really known if is actually singing or not, or if he's just mouthing. And you hear a few sneezes and some exclamations of pain, but that's really it.
But no spoken word.
No.
Yes.
And for those who are curious, you can find recordings of Harpo speaking. There's one, I think he's dictating part of his autobiography, and then there's another one where he's, I don't know, some premiere of something.
Yeah, not overly exciting stuff, but did prove that he was not, in fact, mute.
No, and it's good he doesn't speak, because if he tried to speak with that character, it would have failed miserably, because
it didn't match.
No, because the character is very childlike, and you would expect a higher voice with that. And his voice was very low. It had a New York accent. It just does not fit at all with the character. So, anyway, what were we talking about?
We were unfortunately talking about Monkey Business.
Let's talk about that, because you're not very fond of this film.
I really am not. The gags are superfluous. The whole storyline, or lack thereof, I just find it ponderous.
It does get a bit tedious, because if you're going to have a film that mostly takes place with them running around, I mean, literally running around and trying not to get caught, you really have to make sure that it's gonna be really good because it does get tedious after a certain point. And I'll admit the gags aren't necessarily bad, but they're not
necessarily good either.
They're just kind of there.
There is a reason why this film does not get shown that often, because it really is not one of their crowning achievements.
No, I mean, it's certainly up to this point technically their best film.
Oh yeah.
They've worked out a lot of the kinks.
Yeah, it's not nearly as static as the first two films. And a few good character actors outside of the brothers, but overall, like I said, just has never been one of my favorites. And then the whole minstrel number bit, there's one point where they're just kind of dancing around, each of them playing saxophones, and it served no purpose whatsoever in the film. And since none of them were particularly great instrumentalists.
Oh, was this near the beginning?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay, I know. Okay, that's why I don't remember. It's very brief, but
not brief enough. Yes. As a saxophonist, Groucho was a fine guitar player, yes.
Yeah, he could play the guitar, Harpo, obviously the harp, and a bit of the piano.
Yeah.
And Chico was a good piano player. I don't know about Zeppo, if he could do anything, but at least those three...
He could stand there and...
He could sing better than I could, at least.
He had a fairly nice voice, yes.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the minstrel aspect of that. We'll get more into some stuff later, but to go back to Animal Crackers for just a second. I think the first sight of an African-American we see in these films is of these people in very stereotyped and racist African garb that's a little bit better than what you would see in King Kong, but not a whole lot
not
better.
Much.
And they're carrying Groucho
in the sedan chair.
And then I think the next one, in one of the films, maybe this one, we have very briefly we see a maid, which is standard for the time, and it's not terribly offensive or anything, but for a long time they rather don't show African Americans at all, or if they do, it's rather
very stereotyped and unfortunately it was the period, and you could still see blackface in film into the 1950s, and it's just truly painful.
So do you recommend this at all?
I really can't in good faith recommend this film.
Out of the films we're talking about today, it's probably the most forgettable. It doesn't really have any standout gags. The plot isn't really terribly great. This is the first film without Margaret Dumont, so you don't even have her. Like with Coconuts, if you're going to show this to somebody, or if you're going to watch the Marx Brothers, save this until later. So yeah, not a terribly high recommendation from either of us. Not a bad film, not a good film.
I give it 2 thumbs sideways.
Yes, actually that's a very good description of it.
That brings us to Horse Feathers. For some odd reason, I have really always enjoyed.
Yeah, Horse Feathers is about... So Zeppo is a student at college. Groucho is his father, who has just been made the head of the school, basically.
Head of school, Professor Wagstaff.
Professor Wagstaff, and as you can imagine, he is totally unqualified for this position. Why or how he got this position is anybody's guess. And Chico and Harpo...
They're bootleggers and also involved in the gambling ring, the football games.
And the minor plot of this one is that the college has not won the last football game of the season since like 1883 or 7 or something. They want to win this game, and somebody who is on the side of the other team is basically trying to do whatever he can to make sure they don't win. So he has better players, he's trying to figure out their signs, he's just trying to basically ruin this game.
Yeah, the whole 9 yards.
And Groucho goes to Chico and Harpo because he thinks that they are football players that he wants to get, but they turn out not to be. Again, hijinks ensue.
There are a lot of good gags in this. We started out with the "What's the password" joke, which was pretty much a running gag throughout the entire film. One of my favorite Groucho songs of all times is in this one. Whatever it is, I'm against it. No matter what it is or who commenced it, I'm against it. And he even tried singing a sentimental tune. Everyone says I love you. Just what they say if I never knew. It's just inviting trouble for the poor sucker who says I love you. So some of the music was a little more enjoyable. Of course, the chariot race with the street sweeper's wagon is always quite entertaining. It seems all the boys were having a whole lot more fun in this. They didn't seem quite as constrained by scripts, and there was a lot more action, a lot more movement. And of course, some stock footage festivals on the football game.
Yeah, and this one, it is less redundant than the last one.
Some of the football calls were very funny. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, give Professor Wagstaff the ball, and other things like that. So it was cleverly written. It wasn't as pure chaos as a lot of the Marx Brothers stuff can be. So everything pretty much had a purpose.
Out of their first 5 films, this one probably it's the least probably random, and things are put together in a more cohesive... I hate to use the word story-driven, but there is more of a reason for stuff, and isn't just...
The plot actually drives it forward.
What would you say for this film overall?
I enjoy it. It's a light little bit of fluff. The boys get to really show their characters without being too caricatured. Zeppo gets to do a few things, and bless his pointed little head. And all in all, I find this to be a pleasant little diversion. And it's not quite as cerebral as some of the earlier stuff.
It is a bit more...
More mainstream, you know?
Yeah, it's not as probably cultish as probably their early films are. Their last film that they made with Paramount, made in 1933, was called Duck Soup, which if you want to go into why that's called Duck Soup, you can look it up. It's very complicated and it doesn't really make much sense. But anyway, this was the last of a 5-picture deal they did with Paramount, and for various reasons, like contract disputes. And one thing that also did not help them, though was not the leading cause, was this film was not terribly successful when it came out. It didn't flop, it didn't bomb, but it did not make nearly as much money as
they wanted.
as they wanted. So that was a disappointment, and I'm sure did not instill a lot of confidence with the brothers. It was the last film also with Zeppo, who I think understandably was fed up with being fourth fiddle, who even though he was fourth billed had less to do than most everybody else in the movie.
Yeah, he was relegated to doorstop in this one.
Yeah, so in this film he is back to being Groucho's assistant and has very little to do with anything. I remember when watching this film for the first time, I don't remember if it was the first Marx Brothers film I saw, it might have been. But basically it was early enough that I was not terribly familiar with all of them, and I definitely wasn't terribly familiar with Zeppo. And I remember after the film ended, I asked, so where was Zeppo in that? Oh, he was so-and-so. Like, but he wasn't very funny. Well, why do you think he left?
Yeah, exactly. I will say, Duck Soup, it is what the cultists think of as quintessential Marx Brothers. It is just chaos.
Yeah, it is fairly appropriate for today's era, and I'll let you figure out why that is. But it has to do with Margaret Dumont, who is back in this film. There's this country called Fredonia who they don't have much money, and they are asking the widow of some rich guy who we don't ever really hear much about for $20 million. Which again, remember, this is 1933.
Height of the Depression.
This is a lot of money. They want $20 million to basically help fund the country to get themselves back up on their feet, as it were. Margaret Dumont says she will not do that because she has already lent them a lot of money already, and she will only lend them more money if they appoint, I think this is almost a direct quotation, the most able-bodied statesman in all of Fredonia, and somehow that means Groucho. I don't know what he did before this film started, but...
Or who?
Yeah. And he becomes the new ruler of Fredonia, and the ruler of the opposing country wants to, I think, take control of Fredonia. And to help do that, he enlists Chico and Harpo as spies, and stuff happens after that. Again, it wasn't terribly successful when it came out, but it has really grown into a film people love over the years. It's really making fun of politics in ways that still work today. There's still some problems there that they're having. Then Groucho's opening song is very appropriate. Again, you can read into that whatever you want.
Yes, indeed. Well, and it was one of the first films really to poke fun at dictators, and for 1933, that was kind of
appropriate, too, because I think it's not a fluke that the Marx Brothers became popular when they did, because one, they became popular at the beginning of the talkie era. Except for Harpo, they're very verbal comedians, and I think Leonard Maltin said that Harpo actually works better in a sound film where everybody else is talking but he's not. So even he is more appropriate for talkies than he would be silent films. So that helps them. But also the fact that what is normally called their best films are all made during the Great Depression when people didn't have tons of confidence in their government. So in a way...
And the one bit of comfort they had was a movie ticket cost a nickel.
Yeah.
So many people spent many hours. They didn't have much work. And the only ice-cooled places in the community were the movie houses. And so it spoke to a lot of people about the changing times. Look at Will Rogers, for example, one of the great comics of all time, spent most of his monologues lambasting the politicians.
I think it's safe to say out of their first 5 and out of the Paramount films, this is probably the one that people will always say is the best. I kind of have to agree. By this point, they not only know their characters very well, they really know how to make films and play to the camera.
Exactly. They were much more comfortable in front of the camera, much more comfortable with the action and being able to have a little more freedom.
It's shorter.
Yes.
It's 68 minutes, and the first 2 films were about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So it's tighter, it's shorter, they're not overstaying their welcome.
I think if it had gone a full hour and a half, people would not remember it quite as fondly.
Probably my favorite part of the film is probably the first time we see Groucho, and he's talking with Margaret Dumont. He has this series of lines that just is boom, 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 which is, I think, probably some of the best Groucho material.
And one of the all-time classic lines during the war scene when the shell goes flying through the building that they're trapped in, and he pulls down the window shade, and Margaret Dumont asks him what he is doing. I'm protecting your honor, which is more than you ever did. And how they got that past the censors, I'll never know.
I was telling you about this before we started. A number of years ago, they released the Silver Screen Collection on DVD, which is the collection of their first 5 films, which are very bare bones, kind of released. I don't think they had any restoration work done to them at all.
Fairly grainy. If a film was split, they just splice it together, so you have a lot of jumps, a lot of pops.
Yeah, there's stuff that was cut for the code. These are made pre-code, but later when the code came around, they cut stuff out of them, so there's some noticeable jumps because of that. Like I said, there's a lot of grain in there. There's some stuff that I'm assuming was just taken from copies that are very overexposed, and they can be more coconuts and animal crackers. They can be pretty rough.
Pretty hard to watch,
Yeah, in certain places. Anyway, on Blu-ray, they did recently release the same collection, but at least with the first 2 films, I think the other 3 as well, they are restored. Some, if not all, of the pre-code material that they cut is back in. From what I have heard, I haven't had a chance to look at it myself, but I have heard that they look pretty darn good. So if you do not have this old collection, I think even if you do, it's $30. Probably fairly worth your money, especially if you want to see some material that people probably haven't seen since 1930 something. So anyway, we were talking about getting stuff past the censor. There was some stuff in all of these films that I am very surprised, especially when they went back to cut some stuff out, is still in the movie, because they're very risque.
Quite blue, even for the time period.
At least out of the first 5, this is the film that probably has some of the best known gags in it. Yeah. It has a mirror gag between Groucho and Harpo, which they didn't even invent. That was a very, very old...
But has been copied numerous times since as well. Harpo on the telephone with the different horns. Really a lovely little bit. Yeah, and probably the best use of his horns that they ever do. And actually, funny thing about this one, even though it's probably one of their best known films, if not their best known, it is the first film where Chico does not actually play the piano at any point. That's true.
Harpo sort of plays a harp. At one point he messes with some strings on a piano, but that's all you get. So those 2 things, which are staples of Marx Brothers movies usually, are nowhere to be seen. The music's a bit better in this as well. There's the opening Groucho bit with, I think this country's messed up now, wait till I get through with it, which is funny, and also comments on a lot of stuff many times. But we won't go there. The Going to War song near the end.
To war, we're going off to war. Yes.
It's actually a nice...
Not bad.
It's actually a nice number.
Yeah, nicely arranged as well. The harmonies are beautiful.
And it's fairly large scale. It's probably the biggest number they have of any of those early films. One thing I don't think works quite as well, and it's going to be a bit mean-spirited, because I think the Marx Brothers are very good at kind of sticking it to authority figures and kind of dismantling any kind of upper class or official people at all. There's a running gag in this film with mainly Harpo, but also a little bit of Chico, of them picking on, there's a guy who runs, I think it's a peanut cart.
Edgar Kennedy, yes.
Which... What doesn't work about that is there's some funny stuff in there that they're doing with him. They're messing with him. They're taking his hats and...
Set it on fire in the peanut wagon.
Yeah, and they're doing a lot of stuff.
Dancing in the bucket of lemonade. And it's...
What doesn't work about it, though, is that he doesn't do anything to them to really justify them picking on him. He's just standing there, and they bump into him, and rightfully so, he gets a little annoyed with them. And then, just because of that, they decide to basically ruin his business. Harpo tries to get in bed with his wife later, and it's just...
That section for me never has worked either. And they gave Edgar Kennedy absolutely nothing to work on, and he was one of the great foils for Laurel and Hardy. He was in a lot of the Our Gang films. Yeah. And he is a great foil, and they just didn't really work with him well.
And they could have easily fixed the stuff, too. It wouldn't take that much to change to make his stuff work.
Yeah.
At least it would have been more justified. I mean, it's still... That material in the film, especially the stuff more near the beginning of the film that he's in, is stuff that probably drags the most. It just kind of goes on and on.
It really did not need to be there, and it may, in fact, be a better film if it wasn't there. They serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. Plus, I like Edgar Kennedy, so I hate seeing his talent being wasted. Like I said, for the average Marxist, it really is considered the pinnacle of Marxian production values.
This one is pretty good for first film. If you want to
Yeah.
see, again, a quote-unquote pure Marx Brothers
Yeah.
film, this is really the best one to see.
You get a true taste of.
Yeah, what they are like, so you can at least see what they were all about. This was the last film of Zeppo, and the three remaining brothers left Paramount, and Chico, who was a very, 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 very bad gambler, which caused problems with him later in life. Eventually, that will be a topic for another day. But he liked playing cards, and he was playing cards, I think, with Irving Thalberg, who was the young wonder boy of MGM. And long story short, Thalberg convinced the brothers to move over to MGM. One of his things that they changed, starting with this next film, is they basically give the brothers an actual plot to work around. And Thalberg's basically reasoning for that was it would give you more rooting potential for them because they'll pick on people who deserve it. There'll be clear villains, there'll be clear heroes. And he said that while there won't be as many laughs in this film as your other ones, there will be bigger laughs. So A Night at the Opera, which was made a couple years later in 1935, I want to say, and is about, in the kind of Zeppo role, so to speak, there is a romantic lead played by Alan Jones, who was actually a very good singer. He is struggling, is he a tenor? He's a tenor,
He's a
right?
tenor.
At an opera house, who has a romantic interest in Kitty Carlisle, who is not a struggling singer at the opera house. She's fairly successful, but there is another male singer at the opera house who is our villain for this film, who is basically just a jerk. He enjoys his fame, thinks he's better than everybody else, doesn't want Alan Jones' character to be successful at all, and will basically do what he can to make sure that does not happen. In the meantime, Chico, for some reason, is Alan Jones's, I think he's his agent, because they went to the same music school. Somehow Chico got accepted to a music school, and they're old friends, and kind of helping for you to sympathize with him and Kitty Carlisle. They're very sympathetic to the brothers, they're very friendly to the brothers, so it helps you like the two of them in the film. So Chico is his agent, Harpo is another friend, Groucho is some sort of businessman who basically wants what Groucho always wants in these movies, basically money and women, and he gets tricked into supporting and funding Alan Jones, and their basic goal is to get Alan Jones successful, make sure he gets together with Kitty Carlisle by the end of it, and Margaret Dumont, a rich upper class person who wants to fund one of the singers. Unlike the other films, there is more of a plot to this. There is a solid beginning, middle, and end to this. I know some people, they criticize this because they'd rather not have romantic leads, but there's always romantic leads in these movies anyway.
Exactly.
And these are probably the two best romantic leads, at least up to this point, that I think we get. Alan Jones is a good actor. He's a very good singer. Kitty Carlisle is a good actress. She's a very good singer. So they can sing well. They have good chemistry.
Perform well, exactly.
They work well with the brothers. We sympathize with them. Unlike, I think, every other romance in these movies, I actually care about their romance instead of it just being some tacked on wooden... Well, part of the problem is that usually they're very wooden actors with no chemistry, and they're not very good actors anyway. So how do you feel about the insertion of not only the more romance-driven, but also story-driven Marx Brothers film?
You know, in this particular one, it seems to work, once again, as you said, because they are solid performers. The script, it does have very much that MGM flair to it. I think the boys did the best with it that they could. They were able to work in enough of their own personalities without compromising the plotline too much. One thing I really did enjoy about this film, it's the first time we have Sigmund Rumen as a foil.
Yeah.
Or Sig Rumen in the later films after we went to war with Germany, because his name did change. And watching Groucho and Sig work off each other, I always found very, very entertaining.
You know, he's a very good foil for them, and they use him very, very well. I think I've talked about the beginning of Duck Soup. It starts very well, and this one starts very well too. Again, it starts with Groucho with some really good lines between him and Margaret Dumont, and for me, it maintains that quality, I think, throughout it. It is different than the other films, especially if you go from like a Paramount Marx Brothers marathon to this.
It's not nearly as anarchistic.
I think a good way to describe it is the other films were Marx Brothers films, and this is an MGM
movie with the Marx Brothers in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's still their film,
but
it is much more of an MGM movie, which is good in some ways, good and not. I think the best thing about it being an MGM film is the songs in it. Actually good.
Yeah. Entertaining, yes. And, you know, we're early enough in the MGM years where it's an Irving Thalberg MGM film, so it has a little more softness.
But it speaks to, I think, the quality and talent of Irving Thalberg, that he does handle this film very, very well.
Yes. He was a very good handler for the brothers as well when they started getting out of line. He could calm them down. But
this has some good songs in here. It has probably my favorite harp solo in it. It's I think really it's kind of beautiful. Really.
And you actually have you ever noticed when Harpo's away from the harp, he says manic. When he gets there, the real Harpo shows through, and it is a lovely thing to see.
Yeah, I think Harpo, I think he says in his autobiography, in the movies when he's chasing around girls and doing all that stuff, he is playing a character. When he's at the harp, he's himself. But there's actually a lovely moment in this where right before he does his harp solo, he's kind of hugging the harp and he does this look up, kind of very fond gesture that you can really tell he really loved this instrument. He really cared about it.
And how his parents ever afforded to get him his first harp, I still have never quite figured out, because that was a very, very expensive instrument even back then. And Frenchie was a very poor tailor, and they had initially not two nickels to rub together, and also showed the parents' love to Harpo, that they would scrimp and save to get this instrument for him.
Which he really wanted, because even at an early age, I forget the exact story, but he basically saw a harp somewhere and just fell in love with it almost right away, and just wanted a harp very, very badly, and eventually did. And actually, a fun fact about Harpo and his harp playing skills is that at some point, I don't know if it was around the time of this film or if it was later in life, but later when he had been playing the harp for quite some time, he was quite proficient with it, somebody told him that his method of playing the harp was actually not correct, and that his fingering and all the things he was doing were not the right way to do it. So it was like, okay, I'll just learn the right way to do it, and he couldn't do it. And then somebody eventually said, well, you've been doing so well, why bother?
Why mess with it?
Why mess with it? So just leave it. And so he did. So for harp enthusiasts out there who know what they're looking at, because I sure as hell don't, if you see this film, he looks odd playing it, there's going to be a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because I think he was self-taught, I think.
Oh, completely. I think he may have taken 1 or 2 lessons early on, but also out there's some footage of Harpo in the Soviet Union. I think it was about 39, playing with the symphony orchestra as himself, and it is just lovely.
Oh, I did not know.
It's out there on YouTube.
I had to find that. Yes. I did not know about that.
It's quite lovely.
The love he has for the instrument.
It's obvious.
And it's enduring. And I think this film, more than any other, you can really very much see that. Speaking of Marx Brothers playing instruments, probably one of the best Checo piano solos that they have. It's very, very good. Oh, and you get to see Harpo. Harpo was very famous for loving kids. He does a little bit of piano playing, and then he does his harp stuff. While he's doing the piano stuff, he's messing around with the kids they have in the movie. Yeah, it's very sweet too.
Yes, indeed. One interview I saw with his son Bill, all the children were adopted, and Harpo wanted to adopt enough children to have one little face in every window of the house when he came home. So he was definitely the gentlest, kindest of the brothers.
Yeah, I think there's a story where, I think it's Arthur Marx, Groucho's son, I think said the only time he ever saw his father cry was at Harpo's funeral. Yeah. Obviously there was a great love for him and that family. Yes. Honestly, how could you not?
Exactly.
He is the most lovable out of all of them. Actually, speaking of that, being lovable, I watched Duck Soup, some of the other films, right before I watching these MGM ones. And their characters, while they're still very obviously Groucho, Chico, and Harpo, they do change a bit, because one of the things they do, since they are giving them rooting potential, they are nicer and they have some serious moments, so they're not always absolutely anarchic. Because if you look at them in their early films, objectively, they're kind of a-holes, really. Yeah. Even Harpo, while he's still kind of lovable, is really just, they're all being asses. To everybody, and even when they're doing nice things,
they're just so far over the top that
well, and also there's like in the first film Coconuts, they break somebody out of jail, but it's never made clear why they're breaking the person out of jail. It's just that they're doing it because the plot needs them to break him out of jail. So they do kind of do nice things and they kind of help people out, but it's sometimes more by accident and plot contrivance than anything else. So in this film they are more likable. There are less laughs in this film, but I think very solid laughs though. I think there are a lot of great gags in this.
And one of the things they started doing during the MGM years is they would take different scenes on the road to the different movie houses and in between films perform the scene and tweak them on where the laugh came, where the laugh didn't come, what words were funnier. And it really did help hone these early MGMs.
And they would actually, I think they timed stuff with the stopwatch.
Yes.
There's certain points in the movie where today people might wonder why like Groucho is pausing so much after this line. It's because they knew that the laugh was going to be right there.
And was going to be a 3-second count laugh or a 5-second count laugh. Yeah.
Some of the best timing is in this movie.
Yeah, they are truly orchestrated, and the bits work to perfection because they've spent their time in front of a live audience perfecting them.
And actually possibly the most famous bit in this film is the stateroom scene, which for people that don't know, at one point, similar to Monkey Business in a way, Alan Jones and the three brothers are stowaways on a ship that are taking them from Italy, the movie starts out in Italy, to America. And at one point, the Groucho is trying to have a meeting with Margaret Dumont, and people keep coming in the room. Chico comes in the room, Harpo comes in the room, Alan Jones comes in the room, cleaning people, food people, plumber, basically more people people that you could possibly fit in this stateroom, which is basically big enough for a trunk and Groucho.
A sardine can, basically.
Yes, yes. And they fit just more people you could possibly imagine being in this room. And that was actually a scene they did on stage for this tour that they did, and it was not actually well received on the stage. And they were going to cut it out, but then I think it was Irving Thalberg said, well, of course it doesn't work on stage because you can't see that this is constrained because there's this huge space. Yeah. You can't see that it's really small, cramped. So, no, just do it in the film. It'll be fine.
And it's one of the most memorable scenes of all times. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think some people would be annoyed with this film that it doesn't... You would think a film called Night at the Opera would take place entirely at the Opera House. It would just be them causing trouble the whole movie. But they build up to that, and I think appropriately, because unlike their other films, and we've talked about this a little bit, there's actually a climax to this film. And I think that's much more satisfying in the long run.
And that is purely Thalberg and MGM.
Yeah. But I think that works.
Yeah, definitely. Of the MGM films, the first two MGMs, I think, were by far the best. And, well, the rest we'll cover in another episode.
Yeah. We'll go with that. Yeah. So I think for their first film after Paramount, this is a very solid movie, and I think the brothers were very fond. I mean, while they clashed with Thalberg, I'm sure they were very fond of him, and Groucho was very complimentary about what he did for their careers.
Yes.
This movie, while there are less laughs in it, and there's more focus on the romance and the story is well written, the romance is well written, they're well performed. And there still is enough focus on the brothers and good gags for it to all work and for it to be satisfying as a Marx Brothers movie. Now, unfortunately, after this film, or maybe shortly before it came out, or around that time, Irving Thalberg died.
At what, about age 34 or something?
It was very, very young.
Very, very
early,
young.
Maybe mid-30s at the very most. Very, very, very young.
Before we cross into Thalberg dying, one of my favorite stories of all times. The brothers had a meeting set up with Thalberg. Well, they get to his office. He's not there. An hour or so passes. And, well, by this point, the brothers are getting quite frustrated. So Groucho called out for 3 potatoes. They started roasting potatoes in the fireplace in Thalberg's office, absolutely buck naked. And Thalberg finally walks in. Of course, he's taken aback by the image of the 3 Marxes. They're all together roasting potatoes over his fire. And he's like, okay, put your clothes on. We're going to have a meeting. And Groucho's like, oh, no, we don't have time for a meeting right now. And they walk out. They truly loved Thalberg. He was one of the few who could keep the boys in check. And one of the great losses to the movie industry is the death of Irving Thalberg.
Yeah, because his films always had a lot of quality.
Exactly.
About that. I mean, there's a reason why he was eventually thought of so highly. But so Thalberg died, and shortly around the time this film came out. And unfortunately, I think that is probably a big factor in how their future films turned out. Starting with their next film, which came out a couple years later, 1937, I think. They made the film A Day at the Races, which is following some similar things. Obviously, the title is very similar to A Night at the Opera. Just changed 2 words. You have your new film. Alan Jones returns back as the romantic lead. They have a different leading lady whose name I am totally forgetting at the moment.
Well, she's totally forgettable, so...
Yeah, we can get into that. Maureen O'Sullivan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Maureen O'Sullivan's character, who's the leading lady in this film, romantic leading lady, she owns a sanitarium, and Chico is a friend of hers, and unless she gets so much money, she's going to lose the sanitarium. And Alan Jones, who is basically her boyfriend, has just bought a horse with his last remaining money, which Maureen O'Sullivan's character does not take too kindly to, because she thinks he's basically ruining his life and their future and blah, 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 blah. So they kind of part ways at the beginning of the film. And Margaret Dumont, her doctor, the only one she trusts, is somebody who she thinks is a human doctor, but is actually a veterinarian, who's played by Groucho, who basically, I think, just makes money off of her by saying that she is sick when she's really not sick at all. And so he becomes the new head doctor at the sanitarium, and in order to help get a hold of this sanitarium and turn it into a casino, the bad guys of this film are trying to expose Groucho. They're trying to make sure that the gang does not raise money through the horse race that they're trying to do. And Harpo's Harpo. Oh, he's a jockey in this one. Yes. There's some similar things in this one. Again, kind of similar to Animal Crackers. This one does suffer, well, in more ways than one. Actually suffers quite a bit if you watch it right after A Night at the Opera. One of the reasons, similar to Animal Crackers, it is very similar to the film that came before it. There is a sort of a formula to this. Sadly, the formula doesn't work very well.
Quite as well, yes.
Because the story that they have is not as good. Alan Jones still sings very well. It wasn't as much of an excuse for him to sing in this one, though he is a singer at a casino and is part-time. The script isn't as good. They don't do as well with the romance. I think partially because you don't see much of them in this film. And the leading lady she's not terribly likable for a lot of this movie because she's kind of mad at Alan Jones for a lot of it.
And one of the old rules of comedy is frustration is funny. Anger is not. And she's playing a whole lot more anger than she is frustration.
Yeah, because she's, I mean, understandably in a real world sense, she's kind of bitter at what he's done. That's fine.
But it ain't funny.
Yeah, in a drama, but in this, especially in a Marx Brothers film, it just
doesn't play.
So I'm not as invested in this romance. I really don't care. You don't see enough of Alan Jones for him to really develop a character, unlike the last film. He's still a great singer, but the songs aren't very good. Actually, do we want to talk... In a running theme of African Americans in these films, probably the most offensive theme to date is near the end of the film, they have two things. One, they have the depiction of African Americans, which is sort of understandable, sort of stereotype, is basically African Americans as not well off, poor people who sing gospel-like songs, which I'm not saying is...
God's chilling guy's shoes.
And the song they have is not the best. And at one point, they have a half-assed blackface portion.
Yeah.
So...
yeah, once again, definitely some weak moments in this one. Really, the high points are Groucho working with Margaret Dumont, foiling against Sig Ruman once again.
But he's not as good in this one either.
He really isn't, but at least he's there. Harpo and Chico really don't bring nearly as much to the plate. There wasn't enough written for them. So yeah, this one, pardon the term, beginning of the end, and
it kind of suffers a similar thing as Monkey Business in that it's not
a strong script.
It's not a strong script. It's not like a bad movie. But it's not a good movie either. It shows that Night at the Opera wasn't just a fluke, that they had to work for that. Yeah. And they're doing some of the similar things. I mean, they took that stuff on the road, blah, blah, blah. But it isn't... I mean, I guess the best and most memorable gag in this is the Tootsie Frutti.
Yeah, give you Tootsie Frutti ice cream.
And that whole...
And it goes on way too long. Them working on Margaret Dumont in the barber chair in the sanitarium. Yeah. Nice, with the auto lube company logos on their shop aprons.
I will say that for the Tootsie Frutti one, there are some good Groucho reactions where especially when they get into it. Groucho, all he really wants to do is bet on a horse. And Chico is like, no, you can't bet on this. You have to bet on this other horse. But in order to bet on a horse, you have to get all these books. So he keeps selling him all these books and books and books. And at one point, quite a ways into this gag, Groucho is getting wise to what Chico's doing. And he's like, I don't understand how such and such works. And Chico's like, well, because you don't have such and such thing. And then you just see this Groucho look where he's just like, well, what do I need, Chico?
I'm glad you ask.
So that, I think, his expression and his delivery, I think is very funny.
Like I said, it just goes on for about 2 minutes too long.
I will say, starting with The Night at the Opera was 90-something minutes. This is like an hour 40.
Yeah.
This is actually, no, it's an hour and 49, so it's almost...
creeping up on 2 hours there.
And wow. It just drags a lot.
Yeah. It's one of those films, it has a few very nice moments, but will never be remembered as one of the great films.
But even if it had been cut down, though, I don't think it would have helped. It's like Monkey Business. Monkey Business is fairly short, like 78 minutes, but it's just a writing thing.
It's just a poor script.
It's just a poor script, and they just are not good gags. Yeah. I mean, can you think of something else besides those two scenes we mentioned that are memorable?
Absolutely not. I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talent. I mean, there's Ruman, there's Margaret Dumont, there's the brothers, Alan Jones, again, who's a good, fine actor. It's not anything bad about it, but material they have
But they had nothing to work with.
No. Yeah, there's nothing to work with in this film. Like you kind of mentioned, this is kind of the beginning of the end for them. This is their first 7 films. They made 6 others after this. Their very next film was actually not with MGM. It was actually with United Artists. But today, I just wanted to go over the quote-unquote good Marx Brothers films. Not that we liked all of them, not that all of you listening have or will like them, but the first 7 films, particularly Duck Soup and Night at the Opera, are considered, I think, their best films.
And out of these, there's not a one I hate.
No.
I can't say that for some of the later films.
No, Coconuts gets close. I mean, certain points of it, like we said earlier, are pretty abysmal. So, I did not ask you to do this, so I'm not going to ask you to list these, but I did list these before we started, so just so people kind of get an idea of where these fall, at least in my opinion. Of the first 7 that we're talking about, Coconuts is at the bottom, followed by A Day at the Races, The Monkey Business, both of those for very similar reasons. They're just not very memorable. Then Horse Feathers, Animal Crackers, Duck Soup, and then I think Night at the Opera. Actually, that's a good question for you. Which do you like more? Do you like Duck Soup more or Night at the Opera? Because those are the two kind of top 2.
Of the 2, I prefer Duck Soup because it is really still more a purely Marxist film. Love Night at the Opera. A lot of good stuff going on there. Very pleasant film to watch. But it doesn't quite have the insanity quotient that and for me, absolute bottom of the barrel is Monkey Business. I just really
You just like it more than Day at the Races.
I'm afraid to say I do, yes. Because at least Day at Races has a couple memorable bits. It has Margaret Dumont. It has Sig Ruman. So there's at least some stuff going on. Monkey Business just makes me snooze.
It seems like you prefer the first 5 over even something like A Night at the Opera.
No, I'd say Night at the Opera is a good, solid second.
I guess I should say you like the kind of format of those earlier films.
Yeah, I love Animal Crackers. I've always loved that film. But it is about his quintessential Groucho. That is clearly a Groucho film. The boys are in there filling in. And I guess one of the reasons why is I have actually performed a lot of the bits from Animal Crackers because it was some of Groucho's best material. And so I guess I have a particular fondness for that reason. Coconuts, it's a limited film, but it's because of the technology and that the boys didn't know what the hell they were doing in front of a camera.
And some might say they forgot what they were doing in front of the camera later. So I think that about wraps us up. Next month, I'm hoping to talk about pre-code film. Me and Mike are going to continue this Marx Brothers talk with their last 6 films at some point in the future. I don't know when that will be. I will let you know when I know when that will be. That might be in a few months. It might be at the end of the year. It might be next year. But at some point, we will cover the quote-unquote bad films, or at least the films that people tend not to even know about, and if they do, they tend not to think very highly of them. Again, that does not mean we're going to necessarily hate all of them or dislike them, but these are the lesser films and the ones that don't hold up as well in the public eye. But just a little teaser, when we do continue this, we will be starting with Room Service, which was made in the middle of their MGM contract. It was a United Artists film. It was actually not
Marx Brothers script.
It was not a Marx Brothers script at all. Was the only thing that was not written specifically for them, but we will get more into that next time we meet. But until then, I will see you later.
You can find me on Twitter at CinemaPackRat. Links to my WordPress and YouTube account, where you can find film and television news and reviews, can be found in the episode's description.